The Bible is full of images expressing themes that run right through the whole narrative. We need to examine each of these images closely. We need to see how they all connect us to the larger story. We need to read the images. In the 1st century AD, crucifixion was a symbol. It was a sign of something. Everybody knew about crucifixion. Certainly they knew about it in Galilee and Judea, the land of Jesus' birth and home. Because around the time Jesus was born, there was a great Jewish revolt against Rome. They didn't want to pay Caesar taxes, not just because they didn't want to pay the money, they didn't want Caesar to be running their country. And Rome came and did what it was used to doing, which was to crucify people, crucified hundreds and hundreds of rebels all over. One other time, back in the days of the late Roman Republic, when there was a slave revolt, they crucified so many people that between two towns separated by many miles, there was another cross every 20 yards or so, all the way down the road, with a half-human, half-dead, half-alive, poor, beaten-up, bedraggled slave hanging there between life and death, between heaven and earth. That horrible, ghastly symbol was well known in the ancient world, especially in the Roman world, and not least to the Jewish people, as a sign which said, this is what brute empire does. This is what human arrogance does to anyone who gets in the way. And that was what the empire did to its rebel subjects. It was what masters routinely did to slaves. Crucifixion was often the death of the slave. One of the most extraordinary things about Christianity is that within 20 years of the death of Jesus, the symbol which had spoken so powerfully of the horrors of brutal imperial rule spoke even more powerfully of the rescuing love of the Creator God. Paul says, the Son of God loved me and gave himself for me. And Paul's theology of the cross is of a God who has come to the place where humans are doing the worst thing they can to one another, and instead of the terrible things that happen thus, is making it the way of new life. How on earth does that transition take place? The multiple meanings of the cross are sketched right across the New Testament, and the four Gospels, of course, have Jesus' crucifixion as their narrative climax. They're all leading the eye up to the point where Jesus is crucified, and indeed they're telling the story of his public career, echoing a lot of strands from the Old Testament in such a way as to have these themes rushing together so that the crucifixion means what it means within the longer narratives all the way from Genesis forwards, and particularly the prophets. But one of the central meanings which the cross has in the New Testament is the theme of victory. On the cross, when Jesus was crucified, they stuck up above his head the sign with the charge on which he was being condemned, and it said, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And the early church recognized that, and the Gospels record it as a sign that this is in fact the messianic victory, the time when Israel's Messiah really does win the victory over the pagan world. That was always going to be part of the job of the Messiah. Of course, it didn't look like that. As Jesus himself must have known as he went to the cross, it was failed messiahs who ended up on crosses, not successful ones. That's part of the irony, the drama of the whole event. But Jesus, as he anticipates it in John chapter 12, says these very significant words. There's been a moment when some Greeks who are there in Jerusalem for the festival come and want to see Jesus. And Jesus doesn't say, okay, I'll meet them. He says, actually, this is a sign that God's moment has come at last. And so Jesus is interpreting the fact that people from outside the chosen people are wanting to come and see him as a sign of the great transition, the time when God is going to do the new thing and bring in people from all over the world. But Jesus knows what this will mean for him himself. And so he says, John 12:27, "Now my heart is troubled. What am I going to say? Father, save me from this moment? No, it was because of this that I came to this moment. Father, glorify your name." In other words, Jesus sees his forthcoming death as the means by which God the Father would be glorified, not shamed as you might imagine, but actually glorified. That as we probe further in John's Gospel, it is because the cross is the ultimate revelation of God's love, God's self-giving love in the death of his Son. But Jesus then explains, he says, "Now comes the judgment of this world." Verse 31, "Now this world's ruler is going to be thrown out. And when I've been lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself." In other words, something has to happen which will then enable the peoples of the wider world to come and become part of the people of the one true Creator God. What is that thing that has to happen? The answer is that the thing which presently holds them back, the idolatry of the pagan world, the sin of all humans, Jew and Gentile alike, the death which comes to all humans, Jew and Gentile alike, this idolatry, this sin, this death is going to be defeated. Jesus, in his death, is going to win the victory. How is that going to happen? It's going to happen through the new Passover. Jesus chose Passover, the feast of the Exodus, the time when Israel commemorated being rescued from Egypt, coming through the Red Sea, being taken by God to the Promised Land. Jesus chose Passover as the appropriate moment to go to Jerusalem, to do what had to be done, to confront the authorities with his message of the kingdom, knowing perfectly well what was going to happen in the purposes of God. How does this work, as people say? Well, it works because Jesus is there standing in the place of the sinner, in the place of the wicked. John chapter 18 at the end says, as Jesus is condemned to death, there's a robber, a brigand, Barabbas, and he goes free. The way John describes that makes it clear. Barabbas is the one who is guilty, but he goes free and Jesus dies. Luke does the same sort of thing actually several times in his description of the cross, but particularly when one of the brigands on the cross beside Jesus, because there are two crucified, one on either side of him, says, "This man has done nothing wrong, but we are receiving what we deserve." Jesus is dying the death of the sinner. And that draws together the theme which the four Gospels display in so many ways, that Jesus goes in to feast with sinners during his lifetime, and people criticize him for that. Jesus allows unclean people to touch him, or he touches them, but instead of him becoming unclean, they become cleansed from their illness, whatever it may be. And now on the cross, he has gone out to die with the brigands. The fate of Israel as a whole, which Jesus had warned, if you persist in what you're doing, the Romans are going to come and destroy you and your temple. But Jesus goes ahead of them to take that fate upon himself. He says at one point, "How often I wanted to gather you like a hen gathering her chicks under her wings, when there's a fire in the farmyard, or maybe when there's a fox comes into the farmyard. The hen gathers the chicks and tries to protect them. The hen will die rather than the chicks being killed." And Jesus says, that's what I wanted to do. Jesus goes ahead of his people to take upon himself the weight of the fate that was in store for them, so that they will go free. And thereby he breaks the power and the entail of evil. Victory through substitution. If you want formulae, if you want a phrase to encapsulate it, I think that's what's going on. At every point in this story, the Gospels are echoing one passage after another in the Old Testament. One could spend a long time going through them, and Jesus, in fact, does precisely that. Towards the end of Luke's Gospel, he meets incognito two disciples on the road to Emmaus. He's been raised from the dead. They don't yet know that. They are downcast because they've been following him, and they thought he was the one to redeem Israel, but the Romans have executed him, so he can't have been, because we all know it's failed messiahs who end up getting crucified. And Jesus says, how foolish you are, how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and so enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. That was a Bible exposition and a half. If only we had all the footnotes. But actually, as we read Luke's Gospel and then on into Acts, I think Luke is telling us again and again which passages, which particular themes of Scripture Jesus was invoking and evoking at that time. And so we find all sorts of passages in the Old Testament which resonate with this. One of my favorites, though people don't often draw attention to this, is towards the end of the Joseph story, the end of the book of Genesis. Joseph is making himself known to his brothers who have come to Egypt to buy corn, but they at the moment don't realize it's him, but he's about to reveal himself. But he has played a trick on them and put them in the position where, if they wanted, they could let Benjamin become a slave, like they had sold Joseph himself into slavery before. But then Judah steps forward, Judah, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, and Judah says to Joseph, not realizing it is Joseph, look here, my father, he is an old man. If this young boy, anything bad happens to him, it will be the death of my father. I promised my father that I would go surety for him. So if you want to keep one of us as your slave, then keep me instead of Benjamin. And that idea of Judah standing in for Benjamin, I have a sense that maybe St. Paul, who came from the tribe of Benjamin, as he knew that story like the back of his hand, reflected on Jesus, who was from the tribe of Judah, and thought, here is the Messiah from the tribe of Judah, who loved me and gave himself for me, who stepped forward and said, I will take the blame, I will go to the cross, so that you, Saul of Tarsus, even though you've been a persecutor, etc., so that you can go free. Yes, he says, the Son of God loved me and gave himself for me. And that amazingly touching, intimate human scene of Joseph and Judah, and then, of course, that's when Joseph does reveal himself to his brothers. That, I think, resonates forward into the Old Testament. But there are so many other things. The Passover theme itself of God coming in judgment upon the land of Egypt, but rescuing his people, the Israelite people, under the blood of the Lamb and bringing them through the waters of the Red Sea and off to the Promised Land. Every aspect of that is picked up in some way or other in the story of Jesus going to the cross. And particularly then in the desert, when a sickness and plague strikes the people, and God commands Moses to take a piece of bronze and make it a model of a serpent, because the serpents have been biting the people, and put it on a pole, and anyone who looks at that pole will live despite the bite of the serpent. And John has Jesus say in John 3:14, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that anyone who sees and believes in him would not perish, but have eternal life. There's so many signs and symbols. It goes on through the sufferings of King David, the exile of David at the hands of Absalom, and then his being brought back. The suffering righteous ones in the Psalms, Psalm 22 and many others like it, which start off in darkness but then work through to redemption. We can see the suffering figure bearing the promises of God through into the light after all. Climactically in the stories of Israel's exile and restoration, and particularly in the great central section of Isaiah, chapters 40 to 55 of Isaiah, which are all about the return of Yahweh to Zion, but also all about the strange figure of Yahweh's servant, who seems from one point of view to be the Messiah, from another point of view to be the arm of Yahweh himself, the personal embodiment of Yahweh, but who ends up being despised and rejected and tortured and killed and wounded for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquities, as a result of which That was Isaiah 53. Isaiah 54 is about the renewal of the covenant. Isaiah 55 is about the renewal of all creation and the invitation to all and sundry, just as in John chapter 12, so that anyone now can come in and can be part of God's people. So I imagine Jesus on the road to Emmaus explaining all this and much, much more to these disciples. And as they say, once they've recognized him, our hearts were burning within us on the road as he opened the scriptures to us and made it clear to us that the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth was not a terrible mistake on God's part or on Jesus' part. It was what had to happen. The paradox there, the irony there, is ultimately the same irony which takes this image of crucifixion, which was an image of the brute force and violence and arrogance of empire, and transforms it into the image of love, the symbol which says, the Son of God loved me and gave himself for me, so that within 20 years that change has happened. So that now what we find is God rescuing humans to be then in turn image bearers and people who take up the cross, because the victory which was won on the cross has to be implemented by the cross. Paul sees that, 1 Peter sees that, the book of Revelation sees that. This is how the Sermon on the Mount people are to be. They are to be loving, forgiving people, people who turn the other cheek, people who go the second mile, people who bring this incarnate love of God to the world. The crucifixion of Jesus is simultaneously the one moment when history turned its great corner and a new world was begun. And at the same time, it is the symbol which guides us as we follow Jesus, so that we can be people through whom that same healing, forgiving love of God, that Passover acting God, becomes known and loved in the wider world. Please feel free to click the link to watch the next video in this sequence.